Well, I'd like to start by thanking you both for two really fascinating papers. So many questions come to mind, but I was very interested in your analysis of the relationship between Breton's ideas about freedom and the value that he assigned to Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian culture. But I'm wondering if perhaps you both might be able to expand a little bit on the impact that Breton's thoughts about black culture had both on Maria Martin's work and also on the work of artists and poets in Haiti and in the Caribbean.
I would say that the I would say that the influence. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, I would say that the influence of Afro-Brazilian culture on Martins was already pronounced by the time that she met Breton. One very interesting fact about her is that while she was living in New York and hobnobbing with the Surrealists, she was a major collector of African art, and this had a big impact on her work. I think one of the interesting things about the issue of VPV, which I showed, which was a spread kind of all about African cultures in its various forms, as seen through the Caribbean artists, is that it included a photo of Lamb, it included a photo of Césaire, but it didn't include a photo of Martins because clearly she wasn't of African descent. So I think it's tricky because she can be read as much of an outsider to that world as Breton would be. There were some interesting articles that were published in New York in conjunction with her exhibitions, which stated that she was a practitioner of black magic. She liked to spread tall tales, so this may have just been her joke. It's also possible that she did see these kinds of rituals. Levi-Strauss took lots of photos of such rituals.
Hi. Okay, in the case of Haiti and Martinique, this has been like a source of many debates because the interest in the African was already there. And they were exploring it, and they had identity issues, and they thought in exploring the black culture would be like a source for their identity struggles. But having André Breton there speaking highly of that black culture really gave them a push to make it more radical and to really speak loud about it, and because that's what made them so special for, like, in front of the world. That's what they had, according to Breton, to offer. It was the future of the world. Black culture was going to be the future of the world.
Interesting. Well, another thing that really interested me in your paper was the sort of figure of Maria Martins in this kind of quite largely male-dominated surrealist milieu. And I was wondering how Maria Martin's experience compared to that of other female surrealist artists in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Well, I think the interesting thing about that is that many of the artists who are affiliated, the women artists who are affiliated with surrealism in Europe, there's this concept that they fled to the New World, which is where their careers really, really blossomed. Whereas with Martins, you have someone who is from Brazil, comes to New York, and her career really blossoms in connection with the surrealists, whereas these other women had to get away from them in order to flourish. So I think that she was a very interesting example of an artist who made the most of what the surrealists had to offer, and that they, by the 1940s, perhaps had a more sophisticated view towards women artists from Latin America. You can see earlier pieces written, for example, by Antonin Artaud on Maria Izquierdo, which very much conflate her body and herself with indigenous cultures and create this very strong sense of exoticism. Whereas with Martins, you don't really see that. She is taken as a strong force to be reckoned with. She makes a strong contribution to their projects at this time. So I think that the example of Martins is probably not
the norm.
quite the norm, which is very interesting.
I think it's the same in the case of the Caribbean. There's two cases that are really interesting. One is Suzanne Césaire, the wife of Aimé Césaire. And funnily enough, she was the one that really wanted the Surrealism to happen in the Caribbean. Césaire was not sure. Sometimes he liked it, sometimes he didn't. But she was the one that defended them very eagerly in her writings. And she was the one that stated that Surrealism wasn't dead when everybody was saying that it was dead. And the other interesting case is Maya Deren, the filmmaker. Because Breton left Haiti very frustrated because he couldn't research more into the voodoo practices. And he had this conversation with her and this correspondence. And she decided to go in 48. And he made, as we all know, the documentary, well, the pieces, because somebody else made the documentary, but she recorded and had voice recordings and wrote the book about voodoo. And she got initiated, so she had access. So it's kind of as she was like the continuation of André Breton's interest in voodoo.
So the experiences of women, or at least in these cases in the Caribbean, was perhaps a little bit different to what Terri was talking about.
Yeah. But yes, they're not the same. I don't see them as having the same role as women in Surrealism in Europe. It's different, right?
Okay, well, I think we have some time for some questions from the audience. So maybe we can start over here.
Thank you for two fascinating talks. They were both really interesting. I have some specific questions about Maria and what significance you might attach. I thought it was interesting that all her publications and so on call her Maria, and you call her Martins. And I wonder if there's a strategic issue for her in relation to her husband and her stature, and what it might mean that she only used her first name, and what you think maybe the responsibility or not of the art historian is to inquire into that. So that's one question. The other thing, I work more on Mondrian, and what was so interesting about they were sort of like two parallel solo shows that happened at the same time. And if I understand correctly, hers sold out. She sold everything. I think a number of things were purchased by by Nelson Rockefeller, and went into MoMA and so on. And Mondrian sold nothing. And she therefore, I think, felt maybe, guilty or whatever, and she purchased Broadway Boogie Woogie and donated it anonymously to MoMA. So I have one question.
Yeah, and that's something that continued throughout her career as she exhibited. She didn't need the money, so she would say to the dealer, "You keep the proceeds and give me another piece of art," and she developed a really magnificent art collection. The other interesting thing about the Mondrian piece is that at first MoMA didn't want to accept it.
So that's a true story. I wasn't sure of that.
Yeah, so it eventually entered MoMA's collection as an anonymous donation, I think. The question about Maria using her name Maria, I think that's definitely attached to this extraordinary dual life that she led, which I only sort of briefly had time to allude to. Michael Taylor, who has done quite a bit of research on Maria Martins, told me last week that he was given by her daughter a book of photo albums, which shows both her career as a diplomatic wife, so, you know, images of her shaking hands with Chiang Kai-shek or something, and then images of her installations, her art installations and her gallery exhibitions and with her friends. And it just creates this amazing sense that here was someone that managed to truly navigate two very, very different and at times contradictory worlds.
So I just have one question then about her background. Did she come from a wealthy was she sort of a socialite and then she kind of
She came from an incredibly wealthy background. Her father was a politician. So she really in every way does not present a typical case study of someone from Brazil in this era whatsoever. So she was from a family of privilege early on. Yeah. But it's interesting that you ask whether an art historian should refer to her as Maria or Martins. My knee-jerk reaction was to call her Martins, but I think it raises an interesting question if she referred to herself as Maria, almost in sort of like a diva way, like Madonna or something. You know, there's an element of that in it, I think. But it does raise an interesting question, so thank you for that.
He wants to.
Can you just wait for the mic? Sorry.
Oh,
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Hello. I had a question for you, Maria Clara Bernal, regarding surrealism. You see a connection between freedom, revolution, and the surrealist movement. Did I get this straight? In Haiti. Can you talk a little bit more about the writers and their opposition to the military dictatorship?
The writers in Haiti?
Yes, the writers, or not the writers, but the artists in Haiti, and their opposition to the juntas. Did they literally have paintings or sculptures that represented their repulsion to it, or?
No, their opposition came more from reaffirming their black culture against a government that was white-led. And there are cases like using language, for instance, using the poets, for instance, used to write in French, but occasionally introduce Creole words, so it will disrupt the whole sense of the poem. So it will be like a subversive act, like exploding French language from within. In painting, I don't know that it had so much like impact, because Haiti is known by the primitive, so-called primitive painting of the people that didn't go to school to learn, but they painted from what they knew. And that wasn't so influenced by Breton, I don't think. But poetry, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, here. I think that these two papers present a very interesting issue, that is how to represent, or what was the perception of surrealism of African, Caribbean, and African Brazilian culture. I have an anecdote that I don't know if it's true, but I think I read that Breton, when he was to a Macumba ceremony, couldn't stay, or he felt ill because he couldn't afford the rituals. He was being part. I don't know if this is true, but anyway, the anecdote talk about the possibility to have a dialogue, a real dialogue between surrealism and black culture. And I think that if it's, and this is the question for Terri more, because Wilfredo Lam was a key figure exploring the way of representing through Western language some issues connected with Yoruba religion and even with Abakwa societies. And my question is, Maria Martins had some kind of exploration in that way, in a way to find an authentic or a real way of representing, or to approach a kind of iconography for representing these beliefs, this culture, these ceremonies, which we know were without representations because slaves didn't have a possibility to work with their hands. Then when I saw the images, I find that she's exploring from a different departure point and not trying to incorporate a way of representing real beliefs, gods, saints belonging to these relations, the most secret way or the most public way.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There was recently a book that was published in Brazil on Martins, which Donna Addes contributed an essay on. And she makes the point that one of Martins' exhibitions in the 1940s was reviewed by Clement Greenberg, who very harshly criticized her sense of symmetry. And Dawn makes an interesting point, and she's right behind you and could probably speak to this better than I could, but that this may relate to certain beliefs and practices and representations within those rituals, which I think is a very interesting argument from that perspective. So that's...
Hi, thank you. Could you explain again the Great Transparent and what that actually meant and how long that term was used in the surrealistic literature? Was it as meaningful to the artists as it was to Breton?
I think it became extremely meaningful for the artists. You see a lot of work that was carried out in the 1940s at around, what I didn't show was the image by Mata that accompanied Breton's manifesto on the Great Transparence, which was an image actually called the Great Transparence. And you found sculptures within the 1947 Surrealist exhibition also called the Great Transparence. And you see images by Kurt Seligman, which are paintings of, in fact, he painted an image at around the same time entitled Melusine. So he was exploring also this connection of transparency and water figures and these sorts of myths that I was speaking to. In terms of how long the Great Transparence had kind of impact on the Surrealist movement, I actually don't really know. I mean, I think that looking at Perret's writings by the 1950s on Martins, which I quoted from briefly, I think that there's still some of these ideas in play. But there might be someone here who actually knows more about this than I do. I don't know if that's something you've... Yeah.
No,
but I think the Great Transparence were very much tied to Breton's disillusionment during the war, and it was his means of turning increasingly towards a sense of the occult and the magic, and it was something that became kind of an open dialogue between the artists and writers at the time.
It sounds kind of hallucinatory at times, what you described. Something behind our thoughts, something above our thoughts.
There's been some writing which suggests or would assert that it was a new myth that didn't have wings, as some writers have put it, that it never really carried any weight in the movement. So it's... Thank you.
Yeah, two wonderful papers, thank you. And what strikes me, and this relates to what Andrea said also, is that Breton, that there was, in the case of women, okay, in the case of women, there was this subculture or a kind of, if not movement, consciousness among women that was developing greatly at this point. And it parallels to some extent, you know, but that because I know that, for instance, Stanley William Hayter's wife and a number of women artists were creating images at that time that were finally being shown, but they were still trying to subvert the surrealist male dialogue. And that this is something that I think was very, very much developing, but that Breton, in the same way that he couldn't really engage with black culture or really engage with authentic, if you will, culture, that they still were not able, at this point, they were opening up, but they weren't yet able to really accept it. And in Arcane 17, he says, you know, the thing about women are, you know, going to be, what you said, Terri, women are going, this is what's going to happen, but at the same time there was still this ambivalence that we jealously admire or whatever, this privilege. So I think that there's a lot to be explored about what was going on under, you know, sub rosa at this time with women, but that
which
there
is the
still
topic of the exhibition that Eileen Fort is
great.
currently working on, just to give a little plug.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there was this growing consciousness, and it's good to know that that will be explored, but I think also that, you know, they're still very tied to exoticism, although I think Pollen was trying, and Andreas spoke about this yesterday, to break through some of that. And Alice Rahan was certainly somebody who was defying a lot of conventions and did so openly.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. And then you, Rita.
I thought there was really two excellent papers, and they also present kind of a fascinating case studies about the relationship between art and politics in ways that often go against what we'd like them to be. So that you, on the one hand, have Breton intervening in a situation that it's not clear he understood well from a political standpoint, in a culture that he clearly still exoticized, but nevertheless produced a real catalyst for political change in Haiti. And on the other hand, with Martine's, it's hard not to see that shadow that keeps reappearing in her work as almost a too literal metaphor for the totalitarian underpinnings that allowed for not only her discourse about liberation, but the, if not totalitarian, certainly counter-revolutionary that supported many of the surrealists and allowed for their discussion about liberation and revolution.
I think we have Rita here. No?
I have a quick question while I have the mic. Maria Clara, in response to an earlier question about women surrealist artists, did you say there were two examples that came to mind? The
Yes.
first was Aimé César's wife.
Yeah.
Was there a second?
Maya Deren. Maya Deren.
Okay. And Terri, I had a quick question for you as well. Maria Martins is a sculptor, a poet, and maintains this active kind of almost performance of her artistic persona. Did she work on other creative media as well?
Yes, and that's something that I wish that I had had time to go into more. She did work in Atelier 17, Stanley William Hayter's print studio in the 1940s, and there are some extremely interesting prints, some of which are very much related to her sculptures, and she put together kind of an album of prints and very interesting poems that she engraved for an exhibition. It is clearly she was always trying to find a very interesting accompaniments to her exhibitions through these books of photographs and these print albums and these urgings to touch the pieces and little explications. So some of her prints are very much related to the sculptures and probably were carried out after the sculptures. But some of the other pieces are very dreamy scenes of women in trances and much looser, and are very connected to the works that were being carried out in the atelier at the time. And I actually had the chance to go and visit with the daughter-in-law recently in Paris of William Hayter and his wife Helen Phillips, and was looking for traces of Martins in there to see if anything wonderful would emerge. But what you definitely do get the sense of, and I think was a strong influence on Martins' work, was this amazing sense of creative freedom. It's another mode of freedom that I wished I had the chance to discuss. Freedom to explore freely without worry about the expense. Obviously, casting a bronze is a huge expense, but being able to work in print, and this is what Hayter really promoted, was this idea that you could just completely freely explore. And so many of the artists at the time that were exiled in New York were working in the atelier, and I think it had a very strong impact on what they were doing. So her prints, to answer your question, yes, her prints are very interesting too.
This is a question for Terri, really. I mean, I'm sure other people were struck by the kind of Giacometian verticality of the last objects that you were showing, and I wondered how you would situate Giacometti as an influence in Martin's work, partly because those objects recalled the invisible object work that had a lot of circulation throughout Surrealism for over 10 years by then, I think. Also because they seem to prefigure, or at least seem to be parallel with his later post-Surrealist work. That was one thing. The other thing was that, as you were talking, I was wondering about Duchamp and how much he would have taken on of Duchamp. And as you were responding to the question about the great transparence, I was thinking about the large glass as obviously a kind of an important transparency, and again, one that was very noticeable during that period because it was in New York, I think, between 1943 and 46 or something like that, and again, had a long history in Surrealism going back to the early 1930s. I suppose that might be a way of thinking about the influence of Duchamp on Martins through the idea of the grand transparence, very broadly speaking. But I suppose I was wondering if you ever see echoes and flashes of the nude of the étant donné. It's tempting to look for those, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, the connection between Martins and sculptors such as Giacometti isn't something that I've explored very closely. I mean, there's a very strong parallel between her Amazonia series and the work of Lipschitz, who she was working with at the time and who she appears to have had an influence on in terms of his themes at the time. He did a couple of pieces that were based on Brazilian myths, and when you put the works side by side, they're very closely connected. And of course, the other interesting thing, just in terms of transparence and broader connections, is that this lost wax process that Lipschitz was working with, that he taught her, he had worked earlier in the 1920s and had termed his transparent works. So this strand runs throughout. But the Giacometti connection, I think, is a very interesting one. And I don't know exactly how that would play out.
Well, I think we have run out of time now. So I would like to thank our speakers again for some wonderful papers.